thank you so much for coming along to this morning, and thanks so much, Alex, for bearing with me so that we could finally get this together, because I have been so keen to do this, but just never quite been able to manage it. My name's Kat, as Alex said, and today I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity, I suppose many of us are actually, to have a theme like silence at a time like this. So it's been, to say the least, a noisy year, and we're in that horrible moment of the rush towards the promised holiday, the downtime, the idea that we're going to have this lovely period of quiet and calm and reflection, which of course never quite works out because it's Christmas, and then it's New Year, and then suddenly we're back at work again. And I'm sure many of you, like me, are just feeling a bit overwhelmed and frazzled at the moment and just desperate to get to the moment of rest that's coming. And so I wanted to really try and embrace the theme of silence. And as Alex said, it did really speak to me for a number of reasons, I hope which will become obvious as we go through my little meander around the idea of silence. Before I start, just out of curiosity, that idea of an inner voice, how many of you are familiar with it? Does that resonate for you? Do you feel like you have an inner voice? How many people feel like they've got one? Hands up. And how many people feel like they don't really have an inner voice? Nobody? Nobody? Okay. Which is kind of normal. When people study the inner voice, they find that most people recognize that basic concept at some level, but when you delve down a bit beyond that, it all gets a bit messy, as human nature and human thinking often does. As I said, I'm really grateful to have the chance to sort of meander around this idea of silence, and in particular to take it around the idea of how we are in the world, the idea that how we think and how we experience the world is more complex than we, in the Western world in particular, often imagine. I've been fascinated by the idea of the senses and how we experience the world and how we make sense of the world for a long time, and realized for a long time that I'm, perhaps slightly ironically for somebody who is very interested in the visual world and works in the design world, I'm not a particularly visual thinker. And that was something that I realized quite early on in my life. I was about 13 or so. And as you often do when you're 13, and pretty self-obsessed and interested in yourself, I sort of decided I really was going to put a lot of energy into writing. I'd always enjoyed reading and stories and telling stories when I was little, but those were kind of like making up stories. And then suddenly around 13, I started what I thought, in my lovely 13 pretentious way, was very serious writing. And what emerged out of that attempt to become a writer, was a kind of weird mashup of something between journalism and ethnography and history. It wasn't fiction, it was definitely accounting for things. And it very quickly became telling stories of my own life. Now, I was 13, so frankly, I didn't have many interesting stories to tell of my life at that point. And perhaps that's why I kind of drifted towards what I ended up doing, because what I did through the age of about 13 or 14 was write very privately, never shared them with anyone, lots and lots of little vignettes, little stories about memories of things that had happened. Mundane things, nothing particularly interesting. There were stories about lying on a wall with my dog, or climbing on a roof. I was a bit naughty that way when I was younger. And what I noticed quite quickly when I was writing those stories was that as I crafted this idea of the memory and started to tell the story of the memory, there was a really strong pattern which emerged very quickly, which was that I very rarely had anything visual in that memory. Like when I tried to go back and recreate the memory of an event, what I noticed I was finding in my mind was the sound of something, or the sensation of something, or smells of things. And those kinds of bits of my memory, those sensory elements, those non-visual sensory elements, jumped out at me much more dramatically than any visual aspects. I remember when I was writing about being with my dog one day, lying on a wall, and the kind of process of remembering that and then writing that down was the process of sort of cycling through all of the senses apart from vision. I remembered and wrote about the sensation of it being summer and lying on a wall that was quite scratchy, and my hand scratching the surface, touching things. The feeling of the dog's fur tickling my neck where I was lying on it because my head rested on my dog. The sensation of realizing that our breathing was matching and we were breathing together. Sounds around me, some birds. This was quite a long time ago. I'm quite old, so this was back in the 70s, so there weren't many car sounds back then. But distant car sounds, the sound of humming of a garage that was just behind where I was lying. Smells, very strong sense of memory of the smells. There was a huge pile of tires, old rubber tires, near where I was lying. So that smell of 1970s car tire rubber on a hot day kind of drifted over me. The smell of some quite strong, unpleasantly perfumey flowers with some grass in the background. The smell of my dog. All of these things were sort of playing through my mind and became, as I was writing and thinking, this very, very visceral, memory emerged. I was back there. And when I got to the visual elements of that, they were very indistinct. It was really difficult for me to recreate them as some, a blue sky, a bit of a kind of orangey surface of a road that I could just see out the corner of my eye when I was lying on the dog. And all of these things were sort of coming out in these stories. And so it was probably not surprising that as I got older and became an academic and started getting involved in research into designing interfaces to computer systems in particular, I was really drawn to the kind of sonic elements of that world. This was back in the 90s, in the mid-90s, so designing computer interfaces, the graphical user interface was still pretty new back then, let alone designing interfaces that made use of other senses. And so I got involved in thinking about how sound and interfacing with sound could be useful for people designing computer systems or interacting with computer systems. And I started doing a lot of research into the sonic world and very quickly got drawn into a lot of fascinating research into the experience of thinking, the experience of cognition. And in particular, a branch of anthropology that became known as the Anthropology of the senses. And this was a pivotal moment for me in my relationship with thinking about sound and silence. There was an anthropologist called Stephen Feld. He was what's called an ethnomusicologist. So he wasn't just an anthropologist, he was also really interested in the role that sound and music played in cultures. And he'd spent many, many years studying a tribe in Papua New Guinea called the Kaluli. And he recounted in one of his most famous books called Sound and Sentiment an experience. Like all anthropologists, we do love a bit of describing and categorizing and listing things. So he had realized that birds were hugely important in Kaluli culture. They lived in a very dense part of the rainforest, and there were lots and lots of birds. And so birds showed up in Kaluli culture, in their mythology, and even in their everyday life, in the way that people talked about things, in the names that they gave each other. So being a good anthropologist, he decided he would categorize all of the birds that the Kaluli lived with. And he'd spent quite a few days talking with one of his local informants, trying to get him to describe what these birds looked like so that he could categorize them properly. And it had been a bit of a difficult series of discussions, and he was aware of the fact that his informant was getting very grumpy with him. And all of a sudden, one day, he just kind of snapped at him. And he turned around and said, "These are just voices in the forest to me. Why are you asking me what they look like?" And for all that Stephen Felt had spent the bulk of his life being fascinated by sound and music, as a Westerner, he had missed something really important and really obvious. The Kaluli didn't think primarily in a visual sense, in a visual way. They were not as visually biased as we are. They actually interacted with the world, both in terms of their culture and their mythology, but also in terms of their everyday processing of information with the sound world, with hearing, which makes complete sense when you think about where they live. They live in a very dense rainforest, or they did live, sadly, the tribe has now died out. They live in a very dense rainforest where if you want to be sure that you're avoiding danger, if you want to find food or find your friends, it's sound that's going to be useful to you, not visual things. You can't see much beyond a couple of feet. So in Kaluli life, sound was the dominant sense that they used to mediate their experience of being in the world. It was the thing that was most important to them. In our culture, we talk about seeing is believing. In Kaluli culture, hearing was believing. And actually, anthropologists around the world at that same time were discovering quite a lot of cultures where the visual sense wasn't the dominant way that we interacted with the world. that there are cultures where, lots of cultures where sound is really important. There are some cultures where smell is one of the most important senses. But what that really led to in the literature and also in my mind was a rethinking of what it is to be a human being. There's a kind of weird irony about being interested in thinking. To be a thinking being, thinking about thinking, is difficult. We can never escape our own really ingrained patterns of thinking. It's very difficult for us to even entertain the idea that the way that we think about the world is not universal, that other people engage, even at the most basic sensory level, with the world in really, really different ways to us. And that means that their thought processes and how they make sense of the world and what they do with that sense will be different to ours. Now, as a designer, I'll flip back to my professional world for a minute. As a designer, that obviously is an important thing to bear in mind. Even within our own culture, there's a huge amount of diversity between us about how we think about things, but particularly between cultures, that can become really mission critical to understand and know that. And as I was kind of reflecting on that and thinking on that, that kind of really fed into my interest in the idea and my studies into how it is that we engage with the sonic world as Westerners who grow up in hugely visually biased culture, largely because of the written word. If you recall school, quite quickly in school, visual matters, drawing, writing, these become the dominant thing that you spend all your time doing, and other forms of sensory engagement with the world kind of disappear. You don't often spend much time after the very early stages in school doing much in terms of thinking about how the sound world works. So later on in my academic career, I was involved in designing tools to help us map soundscapes so that we could understand how to add interventions into sonic environments to help people do things. And it was really fascinating to me that for all our sophistication, at that point in the late 90s and the early part of this century, there was so little around to help us think about how to do that. The sonic environment and our understanding of what that is and how we interact with it is very thin in the West. So all of that kind of engagement and that thinking about sound and how it impacts our cognition and that memory of my own recognition of the fact that the way that I interact with the world is very heavily biased towards other senses but visual, really helped, I suppose, in some ways when a few years later I developed MS. And I don't know how many of you know much about MS, but for most people who don't know much about it, it's probably something they think of in terms of people who struggle to walk, might be walking with crutches like me or in a wheelchair. You might be aware of the fact that it can impact people's energy levels. You might be aware of the fact that it can perhaps impact some other things as well. But actually, one of the biggest and most problematic for many people with MS impacts of the disease is on our sensory processing. For many people, it's how it first shows up. It was for me. The first time I realized I had MS was when I lost a particular sense that we don't often talk about called proprioception, which is the sense of where your limbs are in space. And again, it's really interesting to reflect on how difficult it is to even think about these things, because until you can't tell where your legs are and where your feet are, you have no idea that you do that. I had no idea that my body and my brain worked together to make sure that my foot landed in the right place to be able to take a step or to ensure that I didn't fall over. But when you lose it, you suddenly become really aware of that sense that you didn't really know you had before then. Later on, my eyesight was affected, my balance was affected, my hearing was affected. And it was kind of interesting to have that academic background and that design background to be able to think about the ways that being a being in the world, the embodiment of our experience in the world, so impacts how we react to things. Which makes it even more astonishing that a few years on from that, when I had become really quite used to living with MS and living with all of these weird sensory impacts that it has on me, and had got quite good at that, I thought. I was quite cocky about my ability to cope with MS. I had a really big relapse, which in and of itself, I mean, it was horrible, but it wasn't hugely problematic. But in the recovery, a few months afterwards, I hit a really weird and difficult moment in my life. I'd gone to this beach here actually, which is near my house. This is my special place. It's on the edge of a forest, a really beautiful forest. The beach is about 3 kilometers of sand. seals and dolphins and sea eagles. It's an amazing place. And it was probably about 6 months after the worst of that relapse that I had had. And I was finally able to walk again securely enough to be able to go there by myself. I probably could have gone there before then, but I would have needed somebody to be with me to be safe and secure. And it's a place I like to be by myself, a place I go to take in all that sensory experience of being at the beach. So I'd managed to get myself there this day by myself. And I was feeling delighted with that. And I was standing at the edge of the water, doing what I would normally do, which is drinking in the sensory experience of being there, feeling that kind of slightly heavy air that you get on your skin by a beach. I'm not sure I'm sure there's probably some scientific explanation to do with ions or something. But I've always noticed that when you're at the beach, the air on your skin feels different to the air elsewhere. Listening to the sounds of the waves, smelling the salt and the kind of grittiness and the pine from the trees behind me. And then all of a sudden I heard this other sound. I heard a voice announcing, oh, that plane's disturbed those birds. Almost as I was hearing a plane flying over me and a flock of birds getting disturbed. And I instantly sort of froze almost. I could feel my skin tightening. And then I heard the voice again saying, wow, you said that out loud. And at that point I started to panic. I felt really strange. I suddenly felt not myself anymore, completely not myself. And I was kind of used to that feeling of not really being myself. But I wasn't used to this feeling. This was really different. And it took me quite a few moments, actually, or minutes probably, to settle down enough to realize that the voice was me, my voice, out loud, outside my head. I had said the things that normally I would have said in my head. And over the next few hours and days, I gradually realized that what had happened was that I'd lost my inner voice. The voice that up until then had largely accompanied me through life, this constant little chatter that's going on in our heads, had gone. And it wasn't going to come back, I didn't know then, for quite some months. And in the intervening period, I think it's probably one of the most disorienting and difficult experiences I've ever had in my life, and I've had a fair few difficult experiences in my life. I really struggled to hold on to a sense of myself. I really struggled to do even the simplest things. Reading, talking to people, walking down the street, they all became really difficult. And what I gradually began to realize was that all of those things are things that normally I would have done with a constant babble. The first things I noticed was that just going anywhere, moving around in the world became really difficult because I was constantly feeling slightly taken aback or afraid or frightened by things that appeared in my eyesight or that I heard. And I realized that in the past, I would almost certainly have had some sort of inner voice commenting on things as I was going. Oh, there's a car over there, you better watch out for that. Oh, there's so-and-so over there. Oh, that person looks grumpy. What was that noise? That little constant stream of talk that I had was just not there. I was just this kind of empty thing walking through the world, assaulted by all the sensory information, but with no voice in my head to help me make sense of it. And naturally enough, I got interested then in the idea of inner speech and inner voice. And there is a really fascinating literature on this, which has got even more interesting more recently as neuroscience has given people the capacity to start looking at what's actually happening in your brain when you are experiencing inner speech or inner voices. The developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who's kind of the father of developmental psychology, explained inner speech really beautifully as a function that we acquire as children, so we're not born with it. It's something that happens because we're born into a social world. As soon as you're born, unless you're very, very unlucky, you are surrounded by people talking. So the world that you inhabit as a small child, as a baby and a small child, is a world of conversation, of dialogue, of talk. And quite quickly, children develop a function as they're learning to speak called private speech. So they're speaking out loud, but the speech is aimed at themselves. Many of us who are parents will remember those lovely moments when you realize your 4-year-old is babbling away to itself as it plays some game, announcing things, debating things, telling the story of what they're doing. That kind of private speech is the first manifestation of what eventually becomes inner speech. It's that talking to ourselves, accounting for our experience in the world, perhaps making ourselves feel less lonely about the fact that we are these strange, lonely little things floating through space in a body, and in the West, as we often think, trapped up there, although of course as embodiment teaches us that is not where thinking really happens. So as children get a bit older, they gradually bring that voice inside and they shut it off. I'm sure most of you will remember when you're being taught to read, that's a very embodied thing that you do when you're small. You use your finger to trace the words. You speak aloud the sounds and then the words as you get better and better at it. And then at some point, probably around 7 or 8 for me, I think, I remember noticing that grown-ups don't do that. Grown-ups don't mouth things. They don't say the words when they're reading. They read silently. And so you quickly learn that that's the appropriate thing to do, and you pull that back inside. And the idea of speaking to yourself out loud, for most of us, particularly in Western cultures, is associated with something unusual or odd, or even perhaps an illness or a scary thing. Inner speech isn't exactly the same as hearing voices, but they're related. The interest in inner speech in science is particularly focused on areas where inner speech has become pathological or a sign of something. We know that there's lots of different kinds of inner speech. So your inner speech can be conversational. You're debating things in your head with yourself. It can be a commentary. So you're just constantly commenting. A lot of inner speech is just, oh, there's a bike. Oh, there's a car. Oh, there's Joe. The kind of thing you do out loud to your kids and then realize when you're older that it keeps happening in your head. So even though my children are very grown up now, I still find myself saying loudly in my head, now that my inner voice is back, oh, fire engine. Oh, police car. Those things are features of that learning to notice and account for things. It's normal for us to do this. But what interested me was not so much that idea of looking at inner speech as interesting in terms of its pathology or when it goes wrong or when it's a sign of something, like certain kinds of inner speech, hypercritical inner speech can be a sign of depression and anxiety. But what interested me was just having lost that inner speech, I suddenly became aware of quite how embodied we are in the world, how much that's important to us to be here now in the world as embodied beings, taking in sensory information and thinking about that in ways that aren't just the kind of abstract idea we often have in the West of this brain, which is a bit like a computer that's processing things. But actually our whole bodies and our whole experience of being in the world are shaping and judging and nudging along our thought processes. And that when bits of that start to go wrong, you really realize how much you rely on those things. My inner voice eventually came back, but what was interesting was it wasn't the same. The inner voice that I remember, and this may be a fantasy of my imagination, I'll never know, but my memory of my inner voice is of a much brighter, chattier, lighter kind of a voice. It was a sort of steady stream of quite inane conversation. My inner voice now is a lot more like this one, actually. It's a lot more ponderous and it's darker and deeper, slower. It doesn't comment on quite as much. And I can actually switch it off quite easily now, which I never was aware of being able to do before. And I don't mean by that kind of idea of mindfulness or meditating. I just mean literally hearing nothing inside there. Now when I go to the beach, I can switch it off and be comfortable with that and focus on other kinds of sensory experiences of being there. Whereas before, I don't think I could have done that. That silence, that experience of that silence taught me a huge amount about what it is to be a human being and made me really rethink a lot of my own experiences of life, a lot of what matters and what's important to me. And it's also been helpful as a designer to think about the nature of thinking and the ways that impact how we react to things and how we use things and how we do things. But I think also, particularly at this time of year, there's something really reassuring about spending a little bit of time with your inner voice in a more conscious way, of attending to your inner voice, being aware of your inner voice, and starting to understand the role that can play in your life. There have been times in my life when my inner voice has been very destructive. There's been times when it's been very handy. It's got me through some tough times. There's been times when it's got in the way and distracted me and caused accidents. But all of those experiences have been really fundamentally a revelation around the idea that we are not computers processing information and making decisions. We are living, breathing, sensory beings who have been taught to cut off a lot of that sensory experience of life, but can reclaim that quite easily. So I'm going to wrap up now by just suggesting that we spend a moment in silence, enjoying being in this acoustically fascinating room, by the way, enjoying being in here, and just take a little moment of silence and just perhaps have a little chat with your inner voice, see where it's at. Thank you.